Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be doing an in-depth review of the Sigma 56mm 1.4 DC-DN contemporary lens. I hope you're enjoying this episode, and if you like my style, I highly encourage you to check out my F11 Photography Podcast. It's a weekly podcast where we discuss all in-depth things photography related. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can check us out on both Apple and Spotify, but now back to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So they say that big packages can come in small sizes, and if that's the case, we're hoping that the 56mm 1.4 DC-DN from Sigma is one of those packages. So this is one of three lenses that they make in the contemporary line. They make a 16mm 1.4, they make a 30mm 1.4, which I actually reviewed in my Street Photography Austin episode, link in the description below. And then you have the 56 1.4. 56, of course, is 84mm when you take a 1.5 crop factor into consideration. However, of course, you're only getting bokeh and compression characteristics of a 56mm lens, but that is the APS-C life. 56mm in the APS-C Fuji world, that is of course your medium telephoto portrait lens, your quintessential portrait lens, and so we're going to run this guy through the paces in today's episode to see if he's going to pull that off. However, before we get started and before I show you some examples of how this guy performs in portrait situations, let's go through the specs. The Sigma 56mm f1.4 DC-DN contemporary lens is made for APS-C. It has an aperture range of 1.4 to f16. It has 9 rounded aperture blades, it has 10 elements and 6 groups. It's the equivalent of 85mm in full frame. It uses a stepping motor AF system. It boasts a superb multi-layer coating. It's weather sealed. It has 1 SLD element and 2 spherical elements. Its angle of view is 28.5 degrees. Its minimum focusing distance is 1.6 feet or 50 centimeters. It has no image stabilization, which shouldn't surprise you for a lens that is this small and this light. Speaking of small and light, it's a tiny 2.6 by 2.4 inches or 66.5 by 59.8 millimeters. Then it's only a weight of 9.9 ounces or 280 grams. Yes, you have a portrait lens that is just a little bit over half a pound, and that is pretty awesome when you consider what your alternatives are in the full frame world. My 85mm lenses tend to be over 2 pounds, so this is actually about a quarter of the weight of many flagship portrait lenses in the full frame world. My general impressions is that it has a very sleek design. It looks like a good combination of metal, rubber, and plastic. It's very stout, despite its small size. Despite the small footprint that this lens gives you, the focus ring is large enough. With 2 fingers and a thumb, you can get a very smooth throw on this, and I find that it's very easy to use out in the field. There is no aperture ring for all you Fuji purists out there, I regret to inform you. My general opinion of this lens is that the quality of it falls somewhere between the older 56mm and the newer 56mm from Fuji. Yes, the original 56 1.2 compared to this Sigma Contemporary, I much favor the Sigma Contemporary. When you shoot the Fuji wide open, it's super soft and the chromatic aberration on it is insane. It actually looks like somebody took a highlighter and drew over where contrast areas are, high contrast areas are, and so that's not really good considering that lens used to be $1,000, and of course it was long in the tooth, and that's why Fuji has replaced it. But for those of you who can't afford $1,000, for less than half of that, you can get results like this. With a little little research online, it's pretty obvious that all Sigma did here was they took the Sony Contemporary, they chopped the end off, and they put a Fuji mount on it. And yes, that is a half-decade old design, but don't let that fool you. This lens delivers quality. It's sharp, it delivers smooth bokeh, it gives you great subject isolation, and it's a very appealing focal length for portrait photographers such as myself. I've even tried this lens out on 3 different X-Trans sensors. I've tried it out on the X-T20, I've tried it out on the XS10, and I've tried it out on the brand new 40 megapixel X-H2, and it resolves incredibly well on all 3 camera bodies. I've taken it out on environmental portrait sessions, and it did admirably, and it's demonstrated to me that you could be a professional headshot photographer, use this lens, and make a lot of money. Now keep in mind, I have not had this lens for 2 or 3 months. I've had this lens for almost a year and a half. I got it the month it came out, and it has absolutely been part of my arsenal. It's been effective, and my clients have loved the shots that I've taken with it. I've even taken this lens and put it on my converted full spectrum Fuji X-T20, which sees in both infrared and ultraviolet. And I'm happy to report that there were no hotspots on the infrared side, and it lets in enough ultraviolet light to where you can actually use this lens for UV photography. So when you take all of these factors into consideration, the 56 1.4 is pretty hard to beat for the price, especially when you talk about in terms of image quality and the fact that it's a tiny lens. So what are the pros of this lens? Well, image quality for one, considering the fact that this lens can practically fit in my pocket. As a matter of fact, I just put it in my pocket. When you think of the large full-frame 85mm lenses from Canon, Sony, Nikon, they're usually $3,000. They usually weigh a couple pounds. Yeah, some of them can get down to 1.2, but some of them are actually just like this, and being that they're 1.4. Obviously, with an APS-C sensor, you can make the lenses a little smaller, and in this case, a lot smaller, because it's about a quarter of the weight, it fits in your pocket, and it still goes to 1.4, and it's still a sharp lens. Other pros, obviously weight. I mean, I can sit here and just kind of do this. It's almost like a toy. I'm just tossing it around, no big deal. That's pretty awesome. Of course, there is no image stabilization in it, so there's really nothing shaking around. I don't want to say it feels like a toy because it is very stout, as I mentioned earlier, with its rugged build quality. As I mentioned, the focus ring on it was smooth. I put that under the pros. And of course, the price, $429 US. And for a lot of you, this is perfectly fine as your primary portrait lens. Could it be professional? Absolutely. You can see right here, I did some shoots with some agency models, and these look like professional images to me. And so there's no reason why it couldn't deliver professional level quality images for you. So I've spent the majority of this episode singing the praises of the 56 for portraiture, and rightfully so. It does a fantastic job, but one place where I think it also excels is street photography. The compact size of the lens, you take it with a smaller XT body, you can be pretty discreet, and sometimes you want to pull your subject a little closer to you, and this lens fits that bill. Also keep in mind, sometimes you find yourself having to crop a street photography shot because you're too wide. Oftentimes you won't have to do that with this lens, and that's an underrated aspect to think about. I also just use this lens sometimes for creative shots. I'm sitting here with my buddy Raphael, and as you can see right here, the bokeh is pretty darn smooth on it, but I just got some creative shots of my whiskey glass and some shadow play in the bar, and I think it's pretty creative for that sort of thing. For video, as you can see right here, it's a tiny bit shaky. Now, some of that may be the fact that I was drinking an old fashioned with rye in it, but you are gonna need slightly steady hands to use this longer focal length, or you're gonna have to use something like a gimbal, but it can absolutely do a fantastic job of video. The focus on it was fine, and it sets up for some really great head and shoulders type shots with great subject isolation. So now let's talk about the cons. For you Fuji purists out there, this could be a con, which is that there is no aperture ring. Honestly, for me, as a Canon user, I really don't care about that because I'm coming over from the PASM world. I can just use a command dial on the rear of my camera and it controls aperture, so that's not really a big deal to me, but it could be a big deal to you. The only other thing, and this is a con to me, is that there is no MF, AF switch on the side. That we do have in the Canon world, and so it's a little bit odd that I have to go into my menus or program a button. That seems to be something that they omitted from this lens, but by no means is that a deal breaker because I'm shooting this thing wide open most of the time because I want to get that bokeh. And not a lot of people are shooting at 1.4 f2 in manual focus anyway, because with a medium telephoto lens, you're going to probably miss focus. And also the eye detect on the Fuji cameras is pretty awesome. The autofocus with this worked just fine, so I don't really look at that as being a big deal. So who should buy this lens? Portrait photographers, duh. If you're a portrait photographer, you're coming up, you want the best bang for the buck, this lens is going to give you just that. Who should avoid this lens? Obviously, if you're one of those diehard Fuji people who lives and dies by the aperture ring, you're going to skip this one. But you may be primarily a portrait photographer who wants to squeeze every little bit of quality out to make yourself stand out from your competition. And if that's the case, you're probably already looking at the new 56 1.2 from Fuji, or maybe even the 50 1.0. So yes, this is a big package being delivered in a small body. If you're on the fence about it, I say buy with confidence. This is an awesome lens. And outside of the Viltrox 75 1.2, which I really don't compare to this because it's 19 millimeters longer, I would say that this is the best portrait lens value in the entire Fuji XF lineup. That does it for today's episode. I thank each and every one of you for watching today. I hope you found this review to be useful. I hope you found it to be helpful. And most of all, I hope you found it to be honest and fair. If you like this channel, I humbly ask you, click the subscribe button below. If you're a fan of this channel and you're a fan of my style and you want to hear my discussions more in depth, I highly recommend you check out the F11 Photography Podcast that I do weekly with Brandon Gorey. It's available on all major platforms, including Apple and Spotify. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.